This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we're going to talk about the lifecycle approach to cleaning. Cleaning validation is critical to the pharmaceutical industry, ensuring that risks of contamination, product carryover, and cross-contamination are controlled, minimized, and monitored to maintain patient safety and product quality. Today, we'll discuss the lifecycle approach to cleaning validation and the importance of creating cGMP-approved cleaning programs that encompass the applications, methods, and controls necessary for creation and launch of compliant cleaning programs that meet or exceed regulatory expectations. Our guest today is an expert in developing and training on these programs. Please welcome Rich Forsyth. Rich, it's great to have you with us.
Good morning, Stacey. Great to be here.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. And it looks like the sun's shining in on you. I love it.
At least for today.
Exactly. So, Rich, this is an important topic, and a lot of people don't, they think cleaning is just something to do. And it's one thing to, tick off the list. But really, there needs to be a formalized program in place. And before we dive in on that, I want to start with a brief overview of cleaning regulations. Almost every regulatory agency has guidances here, most of which have been updated in the past couple of years. So for our listeners, Rich, what is the current regulatory thought on cleaning? And have you seen changes to the requirements as a result of the COVID pandemic?
That's an interesting question because, the FDA really hasn't updated their guidance since 1993. EMA revised theirs in 2015. And, the basic idea is you clean your equipment and you get it clean enough. It's the level of detail that has constantly increased over the years. So I guess examples of things that have come up in the last couple of years would be critical cleaning parameters, which they didn't worry about in the past. Continued process verification after you get validation. You're expected to maintain your program. And that was always the expectation, but in the past, companies would validate and then they thought it was over.
Yeah,
and,
right.
It would just get dropped.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the whole point of the life cycle approach, to maintain that consciousness that the program is ongoing. Very similar to a manufacturing process validation.
Sure. So a cleaning validation life cycle starts with the cleaning assessment then, if you're going back to the beginning, in which the cleaning activities that need to be conducted are chosen. What are some considerations then for identifying and prioritizing those key cleaning activities?
I'm assuming you have something in place, and so the activities would depend on the change you're going to make. If you're changing products, then you would have to assess that. If you're changing equipment, you would look at that. If you're changing a minor component of your cleaning procedure, the risk is much lower there. So it depends on the aspect you're looking at. And what risk it plays in your, whether it impacts your cleaning validation. That makes sense?
Sure. So give us an example maybe of something that would spark the need to do a new cleaning assessment, I guess.
The easiest one is bringing in a new product.
Sure.
So if you bring in a new product, you're going to assess whether it's a new worst case. So you validated your program. Is the new product such an impactful change that you need to revalidate your whole program? If it's harder to clean, you would probably have to revalidate. If it has a lower cleaning limit than you've targeted before, then you would probably have to revalidate that also. And that's a huge effort.
Right.
So you're going to look at your changes and decide what's the best way to handle it.
Fair enough. So there's different types of assessments. There's the gap assessment and the change assessment. And can you talk about the difference between the two, and then maybe give us an example of when you might use each of those?
That's actually fairly easy. You would do a change assessment just like any other process. When you're in control and you want to make a change, then you assess whether that's going to require a new validation or not.
Sure, like you just mentioned. Yep.
Yeah. But if you have a cleaning program that hasn't been updated in a couple years, then I would recommend doing a gap assessment, because probably you're not current with the regulatory expectations. And that's generally what I see. I'm usually called in to do remediation. So it's programs that have not kept up.
Sure. So you have your program in place and you haven't really made any changes to maybe the equipment or the chemicals, but you haven't really revisited it in a while. So that's when the gap assessment comes in.
Correct.
Fantastic. Rich, what are some ways then that an organization might get this wrong? The whole assessment piece. Do you have, and if you have some specific examples, that would be very helpful.
If they haven't kept up with the regulations, that would be an obvious one, because the guidances themselves don't really say a whole lot as far as detail goes. So you have to keep up with current observations or current warning letters through the industry, and to see what they're targeting, where they found problems. And if they come into your facility, they're going to look for that same problem.
Sure.
I ran into an example a year or so ago on a GLAT granulator fluid bed dryer. And it's just a large column, and it recirculates air through the granulation. And the air goes out through the top and gets recirculated through vents and comes back in the bottom. Well, I don't know what, somebody finally decided to look inside the vents and found a buildup of granulation in there. Not a lot, but over time it accumulates.
Sure.
And they found that in one company and made them correct it. And so, I've seen the same situation in another company. So anytime they go in and you have that type of granulator, odds are they're going to look for that. Right.
Well, yeah, once they become aware of an issue in one place, they look for it every place, right?
Right. And that citation would show up in the warning letter. So if you can get on top of that before they get there, they're much happier.
So speaking of warning letters, when regulators come in to do their audits, or what are the most likely observations having to do with the cleaning program?
Usually the most basic one is you're not following your cleaning procedures.
Gotcha.
And that's such a nebulous observation. So they'll give you a specific, but most of the time the cleaning procedures aren't written with enough detail that you can assure that people are executing it in a consistent manner. A lot of times some companies will still have basically clean this equipment until it's clean.
Yeah. That's like so vague, right? Clear as mud.
Yeah. My wife says to me in the kitchen, so clean.
Yeah, right. Exactly. No, yeah. I think that is a huge issue, right? Like failing to look under the covers sometimes, or in the cracks and crevices. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So back to my original question, or my original line of questioning about the assessment. So once the risks have been prioritized, the team, obviously has to design and develop a cleaning process. Where's the best place to start in doing that?
Yeah, it's a lot of people talk about the cleaning process like you're always starting from zero.
Right.
And that's rarely the case. So you'll have experience in your own facility. You'll have people who might have experience from other facilities with similar residues. So you'll have an idea how to clean it already. But in addition, you can get support from detergent vendors, because a lot of times they'll be willing to do some support for you for free, basically to get your business, of course.
Sure.
So, and that can be very valuable because they will come back to you with recommended cleaning conditions for your soils. So that's generally
start there, right? As a baseline. Yeah.
And then you can make sure that works in your facility before you implement it. So it's not as difficult as it might seem. It's always the details that get you, though.
Right. So during this process, then it's also important to note sources of variability and try to incorporate your control strategy. Right. Can you give us some examples of this in practice? How to go about this? That's
some of the details that will trip you up.
Exactly.
So in a CIP system, which is like, a dishwasher in your kitchen.
Right.
It runs for a certain amount of time at a certain temperature. It'll have, you put in your detergent and it'll dispense that. And they're all controlled, all those conditions in a CIP system. They're usually not made so you can vary those parameters because then you can't control it after that. So changing those parameters can be difficult. And as far as a manual procedure goes, you have the inherent variability of personnel.
Right.
So you want to make your cleaning procedure more rugged than you need. So you don't have to worry about that variability in personnel.
That makes sense.
So if you have, you'll get a recommendation to use a 2% detergent solution. Well, you might want to check 1% to 3% to make sure and that you get about the same results. Now that detergent concentration isn't so critical. You shoot for 2, but if you get around 2, you're fine. Same thing with water temperature. When people are doing manual cleaning, they're using potable water from a tap, and they're going to use warm water that they're comfortable with.
Right, that they can touch, right? That they can physically touch, because
so control of that becomes difficult, if not impossible. So ideally, you want to show that you can clean the equipment going down to room temperature water. So then the temperature isn't critical.
Right.
And then finally, I guess the length of time you're going to clean it. Typically, I would tell somebody, okay, your instructions should say, clean this piece for at least 1 minute. And then if they clean more than that, then that's fine. But during validation, you would have them clean it for a minute. Ideally, during development, that piece actually comes clean in about 30 to 45 seconds.
Sure.
So your risk of not cleaning it is lower.
Are there instances where you need to where someone might need to test different cleansers, let's just say cleaning agents, for residues to make sure that there are not any, or that there's no, chemical reaction with something else that they're using? I'm just curious if that is a consideration at all.
Yes, absolutely. That's basically all been considered, like from the equipment manufacturers.
Okay.
They generally make it with stainless steel or glass, a non-reactive surface. And then the detergent suppliers, I mean, you're looking to use a reputable supplier who's worked in the GMP environment.
Right.
Because the same regulations apply there as far as controls. So it's certainly been considered, but it's not as big an issue as you might think.
Okay. That's a good answer.
Oh, and the other one was, at the very beginning, you said about different cleansers. Ideally, you want to use one detergent and not multiple.
Right, and not keep switching it up. But I didn't know, if you're getting new equipment, or if you have a new product you're making, so you have new chemicals, I didn't know if it was required for you to go through some sort of process of redoing that whole, choosing your cleansing agent and obviously coming up with your whole process for that new.
And that can happen. And what the problem with that is, if you have two detergents, then you have to do two validations.
Right.
And I was in one facility where they had taken that approach. When they got a product in, they took whatever they were told to clean it. So they ended up with 7 sets of detergent conditions. And you can't really validate or maintain that. So
I was going to say that's hard to maintain control of that. Yeah.
I mean, even the FDA, they realized that back in '93 and said it's best if your equipment has one cleaning process,
right,
and that's it.
I think that's a great recommendation.
It is, absolutely. It's hard enough getting through this with one detergent.
Exactly.
And that's another reason why you want to have a very rugged cleaning procedure, because you want that one set of conditions, or not set, that one process to be able to clean everything.
Right. And so that every person who's working, in that department does it the same way, by the same guidelines, and, you don't have someone going rogue on you.
No.
Though sometimes people do, they get comfortable, they get learned, there's that tribal knowledge that comes into play sometimes, and they just do it the way that they've seen someone else do it, and it might get a little disseminated, along the way. So if you have the rugged process, as you're talking about, you avoid those human errors, I guess.
And that brings up a very good point. Like when you're implementing especially a new system, you get some input from the people who are going to have to use it once it's in, so they feel like they have some ownership of it, and they're more likely to follow it.
Right, and that makes sense. So you come up with your process or your procedure, and then you need to validate. So during the validation of the cleaning process, it's important then to demonstrate the controls, as you've mentioned, and specify sampling and acceptance criteria. So what are the steps involved in developing an effective strategy for that piece?
So I guess the first thing I would do is establish a cleaning limit. And that's actually more straightforward now than it used to be. There's 2 regulatory requirements. The first is that the equipment has to be visually clean. And the second one is that you make sure that you keep the patient safe.
Right.
And you calculate a cleaning limit for patient safety using an acceptable daily exposure, which that's what we use in the U.S. and in Europe they use permitted daily exposure.
Right.
And that's a toxicological assessment of how much a person can be exposed to or ingest by any route on a daily basis for a long period of time. So you calculate a cleaning limit using that, and that sets your target for cleaning validation. Then as far as sampling goes, that's not it's pretty straightforward. It's mostly common sense. You talk to the people who operate the equipment and talk to the people who clean the equipment. And it's like, where do you have trouble? Where do you see buildup? Where do you see residue? And that's where you go swab. Right. The trick is that you want to have a uniform strategy about that. If somebody asked you to determine how many swabs to take on a piece of equipment, and they asked me separately, chances are we'd come up with 2 different numbers of swabs. And that becomes awkward in companies because some people will take more and some people will take less. And you want to have a uniform philosophy about that based on the complexity of the equipment.
Right. So you want to define that in your procedures. Correct. So that everybody's doing it the same way, And I ask these questions because I'm obviously not a cleaning validation expert, but I am a mom. And I know sometimes when you look at things, they appear to be clean, but, are they really? And I'm saying that in jest, but to be honest, we're in the middle of this COVID pandemic, and we all know that you can't always see things that might be there, right? So it seems to me like it would be very good practice to, as you mentioned, have a procedure and a guideline that everybody's swabbing in X, Y, and Z areas, and it's being this many swabs are taken and it's being done this many times per week, per month, per whatever it is.
Correct. One of the more recent expectations are that you're expected to have pictures of the equipment, like with an arrow pointing exactly where you're going to take the swab, because even if you describe it in detail, people end up taking them to different locations. So they expect to see pictures anymore with the specific location.
That's a great idea. I hadn't thought about the picture thing, but yeah, that makes it a lot easier to follow and just for consistency, right? Everybody's doing this.
And that's what they're looking for.
Right. So according to good manufacturing practices, what are the best practices then for sampling and testing? We talked a little bit about that, but how do we apply the worst case approach to validation? So we hear you're looking for the worst case, and it goes along, I guess, hand in hand with how you want to make a rugged procedure here.
Yeah, so a worst case, you're going to look at your products, and I generally look at two criteria. Physically, what's hardest to clean,
right?
And then what has the most stringent cleaning limit, and there's generally there'll probably be two different products,
right?
And that hardest to clean product, again, I would start with the people who clean the equipment, because they'll have an idea. They'll all have an opinion. Everybody's always happy to give you an opinion.
Sure.
And it's usually fairly accurate. And then I would also evaluate the components of the formulation, which you can get from the batch record, and evaluate the individual components and see which ones are harder to clean and do an evaluation that way. And then thirdly, you can do a laboratory evaluation. A lot of times the detergent vendors will do that for you, where they will spike some formulation onto a coupon, put it through their simulated cleaning conditions, and give you an idea which one's hardest to clean and what conditions you need to clean that. So you can have a fairly robust background on what would be the hardest to clean product. So and then you would do a limit calculation for all of your products and get the lowest one there. And that would generally be your target. So you'd pick the product that is hardest to clean and to use the lowest cleaning limit as your validation target.
Sure.
And that would be your approach.
Right. And so if you do that and you are using a cleaning procedure that is going to clean the hardest to clean and the lowest limit, then it's safe to say that everything else
and that's the idea.
It's on those standards. Yeah.
Yes. And even if you do that, you'll probably end up having to run at least two validations, because you're going to run that hardest to clean product on the equipment train that it uses. Mm-hmm. Well, that might not use all the equipment in your facility, all the groups of equipment. So you might have to do a second validation to cover the other pieces of equipment that you had not covered previously. That usually happens. So if you're lucky, you get away with one or two validations to cover your whole program.
Sure. If you're lucky. So, Rich, once we validate the program, then, and we're happy, we know that we're meeting all of the parameters that we have established. It's important to routinely monitor the process, right?
Correct.
That's part of the life cycle.
Yes.
What needs to be included in an effective monitoring program, and are there tools and tactics that should be used in doing this?
Yes. I mean, everything is done on a risk basis. So the extreme would be you're going to do swab testing after every changeover, which is silly. The other extreme is you don't do any testing. And again, that's going to be hard to defend. So you have to decide how often you need to take swab samples after validation to show you're still under control.
How often, in your experience, I'm not asking for an exact number, but how often is that in practice?
3 months. No.
27 days. No.
Yes. I recommend that people do it more frequently immediately afterwards.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. So you can show that control, but when you choose your worst case product, there's usually it's not real clear cut. So you might have 2 or 3 or 4 possible choices, and you're going to choose one.
Okay.
And somebody could come in and say, well, what about the other 2 or 3? And I would get them into the monitoring program as soon as possible so that you can show I'm cleaning all of these consistently. I mean, you don't have to do them 3 times, but because you validated, but it basically reaffirms that your validation strategy was correct.
Okay.
Other risk would be if you have like a cleaning limit that's very high, which is often the case in fairly safe drugs, your risk of having a cleaning failure is almost 0. So I wouldn't necessarily test that very often. If I have a manual cleaning procedure, I might test that more often because somebody could have a bad day. I mean, it happens.
Human error, right.
Yes, so it all goes back to risk, and you have to set that up ahead of time, and you have to be prepared to defend it. That's the trick.
Sure. So in a life cycle approach then, which is what we're talking about to cleaning, it's important that the team is continuously monitoring and implementing improvements as necessary, like you just mentioned, to maintain controls. And it just seems to me that the process knowledge would continue to improve, and you get better at this over time. So I think that's maybe why you said at the beginning you might be testing or monitoring more closely than you are once you're further into the program,
right.
Unless, of course, you're doing manual cleaning, and then that might be a different story. But why is this important, the process knowledge and the continual improvement here? Why is this important in the cleaning life cycle?
I don't know that I'd necessarily term it continuous improvement, because once you're validated, you don't want to change anything.
True.
You want to improve like you said, your knowledge.
Your knowledge is more so what I meant. I didn't mean the process. Yeah,
absolutely. Your strategy, how you'll notice things that you might have missed during your validation, and okay, how can I address that without going back and revalidating everything? And there's no matter what, every program I've ever seen, there have always been holes in the strategy that need to be plugged, and you can do that, and that's fine, and you just have to figure how to do that going forward,
and make sure you document it and defend it.
yes absolutely.
Great. Well, Rich, this has been great. Like a back to basics on the cleaning validation, because I do hear often in the industry that it's just people look at cleaning as one of those things that has to be done, but not something that maybe they give as much attention to as some of the other processes.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to really just do an overview again today for folks to remind them of best practices, and also of taking this life cycle approach, that it's not just, we validate once, we put it on the shelf and we're done.
Right. No, it's just as important as manufacturing validation. And in that arena, they've been used to doing annual product reports for years.
Right.
And the expectation is now that you do an annual report for cleaning also. So I think the expectation, or the hopefulness, was that people would then get mentally used to maintaining that program once they get it in place.
Right. And yes, and that's the hope. So thank you for being out there and helping people get their procedures in place and stay compliant. That's the key to patient safety.
It's always interesting because everyone's a different case.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why we do have to have these procedures in place, so that you can cut down on the variability there for these processes.
Absolutely.
So, Rich, before we close up today, I just want to give you a moment to share final thoughts and considerations for our listeners.
Cleaning validation is just as important as process validation or equipment qualification. I mean, they all rely on one another, just like all the quality systems. And if one quality system is deficient, then essentially all the other ones are too. So cleaning has kind of been the forgotten child for a long time, and it only gets remembered when they get observations or warning letters.
And there's a failure in the cleaning process.
Yeah. And that's okay for me because that's what I do. So, but yeah, if companies kept up on it like they keep up on other things, they'd have a lot fewer problems.
Great. And I think that is the point of this episode. So I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rich Forsyth, Principal Consultant with Forsyth Pharmaceutical Consulting. It's been great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Stacey.
Absolutely. Also, I want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. We appreciate you being here with us every week for the Voices in Validation podcast. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. And if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And don't forget to share with your friends, your colleagues, and your online networks. We do appreciate you helping us get the good word out there. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back next week with another great discussion. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.